like to welcome you to the second lecture of Atmospheric Sciences 1010. The objectives for today are to review the pressure variation with height to determine why the Earth's atmosphere is dominated by nitrogen and oxygen. And I'll do that in the first half of the lecture. I'll break the lecture up into two parts that you can view separately to keep the file size relatively small. And the second part will focus on the meteorological windrows, which is how we describe the winds that are coming from different directions. We'll talk about the difference between weather and climate, and we'll talk about water vapor properties and variables in the atmosphere. Last time we were talking about pressure with height. The pressure at the surface of the planet is about 1,000 millibars, and pressure is caused by the weight of the atmosphere that's above you. As you move higher in the atmosphere, there's less atmosphere above you, so the pressure decreases. It just doesn't decrease linearly, it decreases exponentially, which means that it decreases very quickly as you move up in the atmosphere. And over here, we have a visual representation of the density of molecules. Down near the Earth's surface, the pressure is very high, and the molecules are pressed very close together, resulting in a high density. Up here, there's not much atmosphere above to create that pressure, and so the gas molecules are further apart. So let's do a practice exercise. So what is the pressure at sea level? Well, from last time, we learned that the pressure at the sea level is about 1,000 millibars, or 1 atmosphere. So what's the pressure at the top of the atmosphere going to be? Well, since there's no atmosphere above you, there can be no pressure. So the pressure has to be 0 at the top of the Earth's atmosphere. So what about here at Salt Lake City? At Salt Lake City, we are above sea level, and if I go outside and measure the pressure, on average, it's about 850 millibars. So I can ask the question of what fraction of the atmosphere is above Salt Lake City. And from this diagram, you can see that about 85% of the atmosphere is above Salt Lake City, because 850 out of 1,000 millibars is basically above Salt Lake City. So the answer there is 85%. In contrast, what fraction of the atmosphere is below Salt Lake City? And that is obviously going to be the other 15% of the atmosphere. So pressure is a measure of the atmosphere that's above you. If you are 1,000 millibars, the entire atmosphere is above you. If you're at 500 millibars, half the atmosphere is above you and half is below. So in this class, we like to focus in on the why. Why does pressure decrease exponentially with height? And it has to do with the fact that those air molecules are actually compressible. If you put a higher pressure on them, they will move closer together. And so the air is compressible, and the air at the bottom of the atmosphere is compressed into a smaller volume due to the higher pressure. If you remember back from the atmospheric composition from last time, we have the permanent gases and we have the variable gases. The permanent gases are made up of nitrogen and oxygen, which make up about 99% of the atmosphere. Argon is an inert gas, a noble gas, and makes up about 1% of the atmosphere. And you can go anywhere on the planet, and these concentrations will stay the same. North Pole, South Pole, top of Mount Everest, Salt Lake City. Variable gases, the dominant one is water vapor, which can make up from 0 to 4% of the atmosphere. The next most abundant variable gas is carbon dioxide, which makes up 360 parts per million. And what that means is that if you have 1,000,000 air molecules, only 360 of them will be carbon dioxide. So it's not very abundant. And what makes the difference between variable gases and permanent gases? It has to do with the lifetime of the gases. These gases have very long lifetimes. They're well mixed around the planet. Over here with these variables, you can move 5 miles on one side and you can have very different concentrations of water or carbon dioxide or other gases. So the question that we have here is, where did this atmosphere come from? And our leading hypothesis is that it came from volcanoes. But in order to test that hypothesis, we have to determine what kind of gases are emitted by volcanoes. And we'll do this as a group exercise when I return from the trip. And so you should be prepared for this next time. And the group exercise is to figure out where and how you can sample gases from a volcano and do it safely. And what kind of assumptions do you have to make in order to extrapolate your results from this single observation to the planet as a whole? And how can you do this sampling safely? So how, where, and what assumptions? But I want to give you some information to think about. And here's one example. This is Kilauea Crater, which is on the Big Island of Hawaii. This area of the Big Island of Hawaii has been in continuous eruption since 1983. So this is Kilauea Crater. Here's the Pu'u'o'o spatter cone, which is one of the areas that is very active with fumaroles and a source of lava. And when the lava comes out of the spatter cone and out of Kilauea Crater, it can take several different forms. It can have the pahui lava, which is very flowing and fluid. You have the a'a lava, which is moving very slowly and is very has a crust on top of it. And then you have submerged subterranean lava tubes, where the lava is moving very fast and it's very fluid. Scientists have gone to Mauna Loa on the Big Island of Hawaii and have measured its gaseous emissions, and they determined that it's dominated by hydrogen, 79%, water vapor, 79%, carbon dioxide, 11.6%, sulfur dioxide, 6.5%. It's not all the way until you get down here to 1.3% of the gases being emitted by nitrogen. So volcanoes are not a huge source of nitrogen. So how did nitrogen become dominant in our atmosphere? And where's the oxygen? There is no free oxygen that's being emitted by these by this volcano. So that raises a question about where did the oxygen come from in our atmosphere? So let's take a look at what happened to all the water vapor. Well, we know that the water vapor is not in the atmosphere, and if you were an alien visiting our planet and you're looking down on our planet, you might be inclined to call our planet ocean instead of Earth. So where did all that water go? Well, you know from high school or even elementary school, the water cycle. Where does the water cycle begin and end? It begins and ends with the ocean. Evaporation from the ocean, transport to the atmosphere, precipitation brings it back down to the surface, stream flow, runoff eventually ends up back in the ocean. The ocean is where the water has gone in our planet. So what happened to all the carbon dioxide emitted by volcanoes? Because that should be the most dominant gas if we remove the water vapor. But carbon dioxide is water soluble. It will dissolve in the oceans. And once it dissolves in the ocean, there are shelled organisms that use the carbonate in the water to create their shells. And when they die, do they sink or do they float? Well, a shelled organism is going to sink all the way down to the bottom and store that carbon long term at the bottom of the ocean. We also have plants on our planet. Through the process of photosynthesis, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they store it in the biomass and in the soil and the root systems. The process of photosynthesis also gives off oxygen to the atmosphere, which is the source of our free oxygen in the atmosphere. So where did all the carbon dioxide go? Well, it's being stored. It's being stored in the soil, in the biomass, and in the sediments of the deep ocean. Where did the sulfur dioxide go? Well, there's a hint. Sulfur dioxide is water soluble. So if you emit sulfur dioxide to the atmosphere from volcanoes, it gets incorporated into the cloud water and eventually precipitates out onto the land or to the water, and eventually it ends up in the water system, sort of thing. So it's also removed. So we had a lot of water vapor, it's in the oceans. We had carbon dioxide, it's stored. We had sulfur dioxide that's removed from the atmosphere. That leaves nitrogen. So what can we infer about the removal mechanisms for nitrogen in the Earth's atmosphere? Well, we can infer that the removal mechanisms for nitrogen are very slow compared to the emissions. We know that the emissions have been going on for millions and billions of years, so the removal mechanisms have to be very slow compared to those time scales. So what about Mars? Mars is a similar planet to us, but Mars's atmosphere is dominated by carbon dioxide and not nitrogen, and certainly not oxygen. So why is Mars' atmosphere dominated by carbon dioxide? Well, the first question is where did all the water go that was emitted by the volcanoes? And there are two hypotheses. The first is that the hydrogen was gradually lost to space because of the weak gravity and the interaction of the solar wind. The second hypothesis is that the water is still there, it just happens to be frozen underground. And NASA has sent lots of probes to Mars to try and get data to test these hypotheses. And they recently came out with a paper with the answer. And the answer is that most of the water that Mars had, it's lost to space through the process of gravitational distillation, where the hydrogen rises to the top of the atmosphere and then the solar wind strips it away. There is still some water present on Mars, but it's much, much less than what Mars had billions of years ago. And that's why Mars is so cold and so dry today. So, are there removal mechanisms for carbon dioxide on Mars like there are on Earth? No. There are no oceans on Mars, there is no biomass on Mars, so the carbon dioxide that was emitted by the volcanoes remains in the atmosphere. So in this class we're going to be focusing in on the scientific method and applying this to lots of different questions. And it all starts with a question. And once we have a question, we try and find out what we know about that already by doing some background research. And then we can construct a hypothesis that will explain what's going on. And then we can test that hypothesis with an experiment, analyze the results, and if our hypothesis is confirmed, then we have our answer and we can publish our results. If our hypothesis is not confirmed or is only partially true, we'll rethink the problem and construct a new hypothesis and then test that until we get the answer right. Science doesn't always get the answer correct the first time, but through this iterative process of the scientific method, over a period of time, we kind of narrow in on the truth of what actually is causing things to happen in the atmosphere. And that concludes the first part of this lecture for day 2. I'm doing this mostly to keep the file size for the video small.